Welcome to CWJah Talk number 18. My name is Greg Stafford, and the channel that I have is dedicated to establishing the beliefs that Christian witnesses of Jah accept as based on the best available reasons. And we don't just keep that a secret. It's our goal to share with you the things that we believe are true so that you can decide what to do and what to believe. It's just that we have come to believe certain things, not because we were raised a certain way, although that might have had something to do with our exposure, as anyone's upbringing exposes them to a variety of things that they then can determine whether to pursue. So, Christian witnesses of Jah, like many Christians and others, have decided to pursue things having to do with the God Jah. You don't always hear to him referred that way. Sometimes you'll hear him referred to as Jehovah, or often, less accurately, as Yahweh, and sometimes just as God or Lord in reference to the biblical texts, although there's an actual name in most of those places. Of course, not everyone believes the Bible or interprets the Bible itself even the same way. So the text that we've been considering as part of this series on the pre-Christian evidence that we believe shows Jesus is the biblical Messiah is interpreted differently by many Jewish people. Of course, many Jewish people today who interpret the text that we accept as applicable to Jesus, but who interpret them differently, do not necessarily follow the same biblical text the way the Jews or Israelites who are involved in these accounts were living. Nevertheless, the question remains, number one, do we really have good evidence that Jesus is the biblical Messiah? And number two, is that evidence best interpreted as applying to him versus someone or something else? So, how can we establish that we have good evidence? What is good evidence? Well, we take evidence in many different forms. We don't look back into history and expect, for example, the people of the first century to have video recordings or audio recordings. They wrote down or passed on orally the things that they did and saw. And we can verify many of those things based on corroborative histories, other buildings, places, peoples, coins, evidence, hard evidence, material, objective evidence that inscribes things, names, places, events that match what we see in the world that we can, through archaeology, discover. So that's the kind of evidence we're talking about. And when it comes to these texts, we're not just talking about the translations that we have, which I'm more than willing to discuss and show are, by and large, accurate and reliable representations of the ancient accounts. We're looking at the ancient accounts. We're looking at the texts that are datable by the professionals in the fields of archaeology and paleography in terms of dating these texts to the events that they describe and whether or not they're original or copies and at what time they were copied and preserved. So, for example, we have the Dead Sea Scrolls. And we've been reviewing the Dead Sea Scrolls as part of our discussion on the pre-Christian evidence because the Dead Sea Scrolls are, for the most part, dated to before Jesus was born. So the texts that we're reading from the Dead Sea Scrolls that in our view are foretelling events that would occur when the God Jah brought about what in the book of Genesis, in the Garden of Eden, is called a seed, a Messiah who would eventually restore things to the way they were, or at least resolve the problem that resulted from human beings choosing what they should do before we were ready. And that's essentially what that account is about. And through that bad choosing, through our decision to do what we wanted to do when we were not ready, all of the things you see in the history of our world, good and bad, have come about. But the God Jah didn't force us to do the kinds of things either that we're doing now or that we see having taken place. We don't believe that's the case. We believe that he made us with the ability to choose what to do and whether to change and do something else. So we look at these texts and we see in them evidence, credible evidence, that before certain things came about, they were foretold in unique ways that eventually came to be described in reference to Jesus and the things that he did. Now, it's for each person to read these accounts, whether they're the text before Jesus or the text after he was born, and decide what you think about him. But I'm here to show you the evidence that I've seen, I've thought about, many others have too, and we believe you should consider if you haven't already. If you have and you don't believe it, we respect that. We just respectfully disagree. And we're going to keep presenting the evidence that we believe people should know about and at least have the opportunity to review and decide if they're going to do anything about. So with that in mind, prior shows in this series, as you can see from the description or if you've been watching, have already reviewed the pre-Christian evidence for Micah chapter 5, which spoke of the coming ruler from Bethlehem, whose origins were from early times. Then we reviewed the chapter essentially of Isaiah 53, what's become known as Isaiah chapter 53. Again from the Dead Sea Scrolls, one of the best complete texts we have, if not the best. I would say it's the best from the Dead Sea Scrolls, most complete text of the biblical books. And so these are texts that were within 100 to 50 to 100 years of Jesus being born and living. And so they were part of the understanding that the people in Jesus' area had, the Jews in his area, although they also had other beliefs and associations with the Messiah. And so when he eventually declared himself to be that one, and the Jews were looking for someone to free them from Roman occupation, more so than someone who would give his life for them. Nevertheless, you'll see that's what their very own texts foretold. But that's not what they were looking to see, at least not from what we can read. So, what do we read? Well, we read Micah 5, we read Isaiah 53, and I believe that those texts clearly, in terms of the most obvious application, right? I understand, as I said at the opening, that Jews in particular at times will interpret messianic texts as applying to the nation of Israel. And so that's where you have to decide for yourself, is that what it's talking about? Is it talking about a person or is it talking about a people? Now, I think you're going to see in Zechariah 12 that it's even more clear it's talking about a person. And I think it's clear also in Isaiah 53 and Micah 5. But understand, we don't pretend to be that we're ignorant of other interpretations people have. We understand that. We respect that. We just disagree. We believe these texts and the things that were written apply most easily to Jesus. So, we recognize other views that they may be possible, but who's trying to choose the lesser likely possibility, right? Unless there's a really good reason, or part of those evidence of possibilities is somehow qualitatively better than the, I will say better evidence, but we'll just say quantity of evidence that would support another view. There might be situations where you have fewer pieces of evidence that are better evidence, but that nevertheless should be accepted over and against a larger body of evidence that's inferior. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about when you read these texts, what does it seem like it's saying? These texts were written for the people to understand, for the nation of Israel, the Jews specifically, and then for people later. So I think we can achieve meaning here. I think if we take the time and we're really interested in seeing who's the subject of these messianic texts dated to before Jesus was born, the better interpretation, the more easy, the more likely is a person. And in fact, grammatically, because it's referring grammatically to a person, usually pronominally. But, I understand that you can also have pronominal first person, for example, references, he or him, and have that apply to more than one person. I'm not saying that's not possible. I'm talking about, we're not looking just for a possible interpretation. We're looking for the best. And I want you to remember that as we read these texts. Now, before we read the text, we're going to read Zechariah chapter 12, verses 1 through 12. Now, some of you may have thought, well, why are you choosing 1 through 12, right? Because, first of all, Zechariah chapter 12 has 14 verses, according to most translations, or division of verses. And then in chapter 13, it continues on, and through the rest of Zechariah with messianic texts. But the reason why I limited it, or this discussion, to Zechariah chapter 12, 1 through 12, is because the pre-Christian evidence that we have really supports best that section of Zechariah in terms of it in comparison with verse 13 and 14 of chapter 12, and then into chapter 13, which I believe is an excellent section of messianic texts. And we may consider a couple of them in our discussion. But I'm in terms of the pre-Christian evidence pointing to Jesus as the Messiah. Okay, this isn't about the Trinity. This isn't about verse 10. We'll talk about it. It's not about some of the other things in chapter 13 necessarily. It's about what do we have that we can date reliably and confidently to a time before Jesus was born, that shows what we believe came true in Jesus when he did what he did. All right, so that evidence is best shown in Zechariah chapter 12 and verses 1 through 12. And in fact, I'm going to show you an image of what is known as 4Q76. So let me get that right here. So as you can see here, 4Q76, this is at the Leon Levy Dead Sea Scrolls Digital Library. The web address is www.deadseascrolls.org. And then, you have to have someone asked a question, how do you find these texts? Well, there's certain books that have, a lot of technical references and things that give you the listing of verses that are contained in text. You have to know those books and then be able to recognize what they're talking about and then look up the information in the actual plates or photocopies of plates that are available either online or in other books. So it does take some research, but you'd be surprised once you get started. If you really just want to get a collection of the Dead Sea Scrolls that show biblical texts and the dates when they were written, just start with the first one. Just look up Dead Sea Scroll texts that have Genesis, Dead Sea Scroll text for Genesis, and keep it simple. And you'll find a lot of different references and a lot of different Q symbols. At first it'll be a little intimidating, but that's how it is with anything that you start with. But once you get started and you understand, okay, this 4Q refers to this, and this refers to this, and here's where I can get this plate, it gets easier. And then you'll find fragments within plates. So it's just a system of organization for these fragments in text that you have to kind of gain an understanding of how it's structured so that you can find what you're looking for efficiently. And at first, it'll take more time, of course, because you won't know exactly where to go. But I'm here to help you. I'm going to at least point you to different things that will give you images like this. So once you find, for example, which texts have which biblical verses, so you see over here on the left side I highlighted, it's showing you, I'm showing you 4Q76. And it looks like I'm showing you plate 12. Or that, well, there are different plates over here. Or it looks like through 4Q12. I'm sorry. So, and usually plate numbers are given in Roman numerals. So at first it looked like a plate number. But here they're actually giving plate numbers and actual numbers. But when you look up these texts, you're going to often see plate numbers in Roman numerals, just like up here. So up here, it's giving you the range of Dead Sea Scroll fragments. And then down here, it's giving you the plate and fragment at times. You look over here to the second row image to the right. It's got plate 296, fragment 1. Now, this image was taken November 2011. So there's a lot of work still going on to catalog these texts. And there are even more texts that haven't been cataloged. So, but you still have to start with what we have, right? There's just, for good news for us, there's tons of material. And so I'm starting with the material that we can date before Jesus was born, like these texts. So this is, these show parts of 4Q76. 4Q76 is a part of the Minor Prophet Scroll. It's datable to the 2nd century BCE, so like around 150 BCE. So about 150 years before Jesus was born, and 180 before he actually, really started openly teaching in the way that he did at the end of his life, or the last few years of his life. So this text, 4Q76, has just a small part of Zechariah, but it has other sections of what are called the minor prophets. And so people like Jonah, Malachi, those are considered part of the minor prophets, quote unquote. And so, this is part of the Minor Prophet Scroll. And in the Minor Prophet Scroll, in the 4Q76 fragment or text, you have Zechariah 14:18. So just one part, but obviously, if there's just one part here, that there was originally a whole section, or at least a larger section than just verse 14:18. Nevertheless, this is one of our earlier references, almost 200 years potentially earlier, dated, not when it was originally written, but copy. But about 200 years before Jesus was born. And so now if I go and show you, this is I'm going to show you 4Q80 over here. These are fragments from 4Q80. And I'll see if I can make it a little bigger for you. So, you'll have to look these up if you want to get really detailed on the images. But this is an image of 4Q80, which is datable to about 75 to 50 BCE. So, and it contains more of Zechariah. It contains a lot of Zechariah. This, in fact, contains a section of Zechariah, most of which we would be referring to in discussing the text that we're reading. So it contains Zechariah, well, maybe not most, but at least a section that would, I guess most, 5, 6 verses. Zechariah 12, 7 through 12. So it contains the verse 10 that often comes up, which we'll talk about. And then we also have 4Q82. I'll show you some fragments here. Try to keep it big. I mean, some of these are small, and remember, these have been through a lot, but they can be, you can image them in ways that allow us to see what they say. So, regardless of how clear they are here, you can look these up on your own. But in 4Q82, this is datable to right around the time Jesus was born, but to between 30 years or so before the 1st century AD. So this would have been a text potentially read in areas and by peoples related to Jesus himself. And this contains Zechariah chapters 10 through 12, parts of it, and it contains the first 3 verses of Zechariah 12 that we'll be reading today. So the pre-Christian evidence we have that is best reflected in these Dead Sea Scroll texts. Now, there's another text as well that contains not parts of Zechariah 12, but other parts, earlier parts of Zechariah, and that's what's called the Nahal Hever Minor Prophet Scroll. I've shown you this before. In fact, I think I showed you this in the Micah 5 CWJah talk, and I may have been looking at this when I was talking about Micah 5 in part, but I was also using my blog article to show part of Micah 5, because they're in the same text. This text contains Micah 5, the scroll. It's part of the Nahal Hever Minor Prophet Scroll. So the Micah 5 and Zechariah texts are in here, but Zechariah 12:10 is not in here. And you can see the arrow pointing, to the divine name, which is all throughout this text. So this is another text that was used. You can see this is in Greek letters, so it's a Septuagint text, whereas the others like 4Q82, 4Q80, and 4Q76, or 76, are in Hebrew. So this is also a Dead Sea Scroll text, but it's in Greek, so it's a copy of the Septuagint, or an independent Greek translation like the Septuagint. But again, see, here's the divine name, right in and among the Greek text. And that's what we believe was also, or similar to, what the original New Testament text had, until they were later changed, just like these texts were changed. And in place of the divine name, they were using those sacred name abbreviations known as Nomina Sacra. That's another show, and we've talked about it before, so we'll move on. So this is another scroll that contains Zechariah. So I've shown you four pre-Christian texts of Zechariah, or parts of Zechariah, that were originally all of Zechariah, and that contain most of the text we're going to be reading today, verses 1 through 3 and verses 7 through 12. So verses 4, 5, and 6, they were obviously there, and we don't exactly know what these pre-Christian texts in the Dead Sea Scrolls had, but we don't need to base every single detail of these accounts on these pre-Christian texts if other parts of the text contain the applicable sections necessary to further identify Jesus as the Messiah. And I'm going to show they do. So, and then you can also later review, and we'll read it, the verses 4 through 6 that we just don't have in these pre-Christian Dead Sea Scrolls, but that are still part of the text, just like the rest of Zechariah 12 and Zechariah 13 and 14. Well, what we call 13 and 14. They weren't originally numbered and divided that way. So, but now that we have this evidence, okay, so there's 1, 2, 3, 4 texts that give us most of what we're going to be reading, which is here in Zechariah 12. So let's do that now. I'm going to read Zechariah 12, and I'm going to read just through verse 12. You can see that there's more here, and it goes through the rest. And I might refer to part of it. I'm using the New World Translation because, again, I have not translated every text, and I'm familiar with the New World Translation, so I can discuss it. I've written about it. I'll point you to sections in my writings that deal with quote-unquote controversial parts. I'll talk about them with you if you have questions. But my primary goal was to present that pre-Christian evidence I just showed you, so you understand the evidence we have that exists, that is available and datable to before when Jesus was born, the time when Jesus was born, and that give us the basis for our beliefs. It's not the later texts, unless they're, they could still be reliable, but we want the best. That's what I'm here to provide you. You can get the rest on your own just by looking up any text you want. But like the questioner said, it's not always easy to look up these things. How do you figure out which manuscripts, right? Well, it takes time. But I can help accelerate that for you by showing you the texts. So if you want to know what our pre-Christian evidence for the book of Zechariah is, well, you know right away, if you're taking notes or you watch this video, and I'll try to put more links in the description, you know we have 4Q76, 4Q80, and 4Q82, all datable to 100 years or more before Jesus was born. And then we also have the Nahal Hever Minor Prophet Scroll, not only containing Zechariah, but other texts like Habakkuk, Micah, Jonah, Obadiah, minor prophets. That's just what they're called because they're smaller, for example, than Isaiah. So, but our textual evidence is incredible. So right there, again, that's not too hard to remember. Some Dead Sea Scroll names are harder than others, but they're all around the same number range, 4Q76, 4Q80, 4Q82. Right there, you've got the Micah reference, you've got Zechariah, You've got a Zephaniah support, other texts. We'll get into them. So just with those three references, the Nahal Hever, just saying it unless you know Hebrew a little, it comes out a little strange because the Nahal has a guttural sound to it. But either way, you can just say Nahal if you want a fourth. But the three, 4Q76, 4Q80, 4Q82, right there, you've got Micah 5 and Zechariah 12 in your quiver as arrows to use to establish some of the best reasons we have for why we believe what we do. We're not just crazy, right? Maybe a little bit, but we're not just doing this because we we're benefiting in some way, and we're looking at evidence is my point. I couldn't even think of another reason why I would do this. This is why I had a moment there. Because, I don't do this for money or power or fame. That's not what I'm after. I'm after the best evidence so that I can use my time, my energy, and raise my kids and help other people the right way without giving them something that's going to hurt them down the road. So I look for the best things that are reliable. And I think these texts are part of it. So let's take a look. I'm going to read Zechariah 12, 1 through 3. I'll stop there. And then, we know verses 4, 5, and 6. The texts were there. We just have certain lacunae or missing sections. But, we want to focus, again, if we need to be aware of that, right? We need to be the ones who tell the people we're presenting these texts to. We have evidence showing this, this, and this. And we believe this is true too. But the best evidence we have shows this, and this is enough. And then on top of that, we have this. Because they had to go through a whole lot of stuff to preserve these texts, right? Dead Sea Scrolls, hidden in caves during the first century, likely around the time when the Jews were persecuted by the Romans and others, fleeing Jerusalem and other places. These texts were hidden for a reason. And they were written for a reason too. Okay, Zechariah 12. You can read along with me in any translation. We're going to go down to at least here. So just bear with me. It won't be long. And then we'll make a few applications. We'll talk about verse 10. That's really our primary messianic text anyway, as well as our most Trinitarian associated text, at least in this account. We'll talk about it a little bit. I'll show you some of my prior writings. We'll answer your questions. And I've shown you the texts. That was my goal. And to also read and apply it, but that's coming up. But you know the text now. 4Q76, 4Q80, and 4Q82. And Nahal Hever. Micah 5 and Zechariah in that one. So, if you know your texts, actually the Nahal Hever doesn't have the Zechariah 12 part, but it supports the Zechariah text. And it clearly shows the divine name in and among the Greek text. So it has its own beneficial uses. All right, Zechariah 12:1. It starts off by saying a pronouncement. The word of Jehovah concerning Israel is the utterance of Jehovah, and the one stretching out the heavens and laying the foundation of the earth, and forming the spirit of man inside him. That's a good text we'll use when we talk about other things. Verse 2. Here I am making Jerusalem a bow, causing reeling to all the peoples round about. And also against Judah he will come to be in the siege, even against Jerusalem. Now notice he's referencing here peoples round about, Jerusalem, and Judah. Okay, verse 3. And it must occur in that day that I shall make Jerusalem a burdensome stone to all the peoples. Okay, remember what I talked about before, how some who don't believe Jesus is the Messiah, but who otherwise believe in or accept these texts, but just think they're maybe applicable to Israel more so than to Jesus. So let's see if this seems to apply to a people or to a person, and to whom, if which one. Verse 3, and it must occur in that day that I shall make Jerusalem a burdensome stone to all the peoples. All those lifting it will without fail get severe scratches for themselves. You don't mess with people whom Jah protects. And against her all the nations of the earth will certainly be gathered. In that day, verse 4, is the utterance of Jehovah. I shall strike every horse with bewilderment, and its rider with madness, And upon the house of Judah I shall open my eyes, and every horse of the peoples I shall strike with loss of sight. Verse 5, and the sheiks of Judah will have to say in their hearts, the inhabitants of Jerusalem are a strength to me by Jehovah of armies, their God. Verse 6, in that day I shall make the sheiks of Judah like a fire pot among trees, and like a fire torch in and among a row of newly cut grain. And they must devour on their right hand and on the left hand all the peoples round about. And Jerusalem must yet be inhabited in her own place in Jerusalem. Okay, now before we start verse 7, so he's been talking about Jerusalem, Judah, and the peoples round about, and the nations that are gathered against his people. So I'm stopping here because we're going into verse 7, and from verse 7 through 12 is what we have in, let me just double check here, 4Q80, which is datable to the about 75, 50 BC, about 100 years before Jesus started teaching, or before things occurred that could be fulfilled according to this text in him, if at all. Verse 7. Now, this is from 4Q, or at least consistent with 4Q80 in the Dead Sea Scrolls, datable to at least 100 years before Jesus started teaching. And Jehovah will certainly save the tents of Judah first. So keep in mind what we've read to this point, the gathering of nations against her. Jehovah will certainly save the tents of Judah first, to the end that the beauty of the house of David and the beauty of the inhabitants of Jerusalem may not become too great over Judah. In that day, verse 8, Jehovah will be a defense around the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and the one that is stumbling among them must become in that day like David, and the house of David like God, like Jehovah's angel before them. Remember how I often talk about how Jehovah's angels are essentially God, Jehovah. There's no difference. That's exactly what they do here. They parallel like God, like Jehovah's angel before them. You could even translate that like a God, like Jehovah's angel before them, because that's what it's talking about. The angel was not a separate God before them. It was Jehovah in that angel. And Trinitarians will often say, well, it's the angel of Jehovah, the uncreated creator. Yep, well, it's an angel. So why do you give us so much grief about calling Jesus an angel or the archangel? Because wouldn't the archangel be the ruler over this angel, since this angel is just an angel and Michael's the archangel? So how can you say this angel's different than Michael or lesser than Michael when Michael's the archangel and this is Jehovah's angel, not Jehovah's archangel? So they just don't make any sense. And then they criticize us for calling Jesus an angel, or Michael, the archangel, which would be higher than this angel whom they consider Jehovah. In any case, I wanted to highlight that here because I often point that out in relation to other texts, but it actually happens quite a bit. So keep that in mind in verse 8, and we can talk about it further if you have questions. Verse 9, and it must occur in that day that I shall seek to annihilate all the nations that are coming against Jerusalem. Verse 10, and I will pour out upon the house of David and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of favor and entreaties, and they will certainly look to the one whom they pierce through, and they will certainly wail over him, as in the wailing over an only son. And there will be bitter lamentation over him, as when there is bitter lamentation over the firstborn. Okay, we'll get to the next couple of verses in a minute, but this is really the key text, right? The others are important too, and they do together combine the account to explain more than just what we see in verse 10, and the rest of the account as well as chapter 13 does that as well. But again, we're sticking with the text we have datable to before Jesus was born, and in this case, specifically to 4Q80, which contains Zechariah 12, 7 through 12. So All right, let me read verses 11 and 12 because they really won't potentially come up again. And verse 10 is where we're going to really find the meat of our discussion. So, verse 11, in that day the wailing in Jerusalem will be great, like the wailing of Hadimon. I'm sorry, this text kind of replaces certain things with question marks, so I may not have pronounced that right. In the valley plain of Megiddo, Haggadim. So there's certain words that are replaced with symbols. I apologize for that, so in any mispronunciation. And the land will certainly wail, each family by itself, the family of the house of David by itself, and their women by themselves, and the family of the house of Nathan by itself, and their women by themselves. And then the rest of Zechariah 12, 13, and 14 say essentially the same thing with respect to other houses or tribes. And so those two texts, though, aren't preserved in 4Q80. And so I'm going to stop there as far as just reflecting on the best available evidence, specifically in 4Q80, as it contains verses 7 through 12, and specifically verse 10, as well as verse 8, which is obviously very important when it comes to these overall issues and whom we're talking about or whom we're discussing. But verse 10, let's look at it. Let me read it again. I will pour out upon the house of David and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem the spirit of favor and entreaties, and they will certainly look to the one whom they pierced through. And they will certainly wail over him, as in the wailing over an only son, or only one. And there will be bitter lamentation over him, as when there is bitter lamentation over the firstborn. So you'll notice a couple of things here. We're talking about the house of David. Jehovah is talking. I will pour out upon the house of David and upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem. So I see a differentiation here clearly between the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem and the subject, the one whom they pierced through. So there's nothing here that specifically identifies either Jerusalem or the people of Jerusalem or Israel as a people. It differentiates between the inhabitants of Jerusalem and the house of David and this one whom they pierced. Let's talk about that. So this text often comes up because there in the Hebrew texts, there are some manuscripts that read, they will look to me whom they pierced, and others that read, to him whom they pierced. And the difference is really just one letter, a Hebrew, what they call wa. Today it's called a vav, but it was called a wa. And so you have some difference in the Hebrew manuscripts there, but the text itself, if you read it together, and they will look to the one whom they pierced. Let's just say they will look to me whom they pierced. And they will certainly wail over him. So if it's me, then you have two going on here, right? Because me is the one who's speaking, and him is the one they're wailing over as a son, or lamenting over as a firstborn. So remember, this is very important. The one, if we understand it as me, then that's who was pierced. And so that would have to be Jesus, right? But then who's the him? If Jesus is the one talking as Jehovah, and he's also the me whom they pierced, or will pierce, who's the him that they're wailing over as a son? And who are they lamenting over as a firstborn? Because in the New Testament, that's Jesus. Jesus is the son. Jesus is the firstborn. So what's going on here? If it says they will look to me whom they pierced, that means Jesus is the one talking. And he's the one whom they will pierce. But then who's the him? Because all texts say the same thing in these next two parts, him, that I've seen, as a son, as a firstborn. So this is why. Let me read to you what I wrote in my second edition of Jehovah's Witnesses Defended. I'll increase it so you can read with me. If you look on page 1 34 of my second edition of Jehovah's Witnesses Defended, or actually 33 in the section here, the bottom section, the basis for NWT's rendering. Here in this blog quote, I quote Hebrew scholar H.W.F. Gesenius in his Hebrew grammar. Here's what he said. Keep in mind what I just said, right? What I just said was, if it's to me, which some Septuagint manuscripts also use, they use the Greek word me, mu epsilon. But they're not datable to before Jesus was born, is the difference. Whereas in these Hebrew texts, the reading, it can be different depending upon how you understand the verse as a whole, and of course, which manuscripts you use. So there's another way we can resolve this, at least as far as Christianity is concerned. But let me stay with just non-Christian means of resolution for now, okay? So let me quote the grammar of Hebrew scholar. He's passed away, of course, but well known. You can get his grammar in many reprinted editions. Gesenius. So this is from his Hebrew grammar, and I give the reference in my note 9 here. So he says, the relative pronoun, not depending adjectively on a governing substantive, but itself expressing a substantival idea, clauses introduced in this way may be called independent relative clauses. Okay, so if you're not familiar with grammar, this can seem a little overwhelming, but just let's move forward here. Keep that in mind, and you can look it up and review this later and look up the terms if you want to understand it better. This use of asher is generally rendered, that's the relative pronoun he's talking about, is generally rendered in English by he who, he whom. Zechariah 12:10. In fact, actually, let me start. That's a separate sentence. So after it says it's best rendered, generally rendered in English by he who, he whom, for abbreviated purposes, I skipped the rest. And then he says in Zechariah 12:10, instead of the unintelligible to me whom, we should probably read to him whom, and refer the passage to this class. So this is a Hebrew scholar who lived early in the last century and wrote, and so whose grammar was available for people like the New World Translation Committee, people like Ron Rones and others who criticized the New World Translation Committee's rendering of this text, but who made it very clear that the rendering in Zechariah 12:10, him whom, or the one whom as a relative pronoun, is acceptable. And he even says you probably should refer it to that class. In any case, there are different ways you could interpret it either way, and it actually does have, at least the text, Zechariah 12:10, this part, to the one whom, it also has some Septuagint support, post-Jesus dated Septuagint support, that says me. They will look to me whom they pierced. Now, I'm going to argue that, of course, I have to, based on the evidence, that either one is possible. And in fact, if we use verse 8, right here, like God, like Jehovah's angel before them, that basically it's saying that this is an angel, or it could be like an angel, like God, like Jehovah's angel. So in one sense, you could interpret this as Jesus, as Jehovah's angel, who is only acting as the Father in his assigned role, doing what he's told to do. He has to agree to do it, though, but he's doing it. But I don't think that's necessary. In fact, it just seems like a reach to me to have to connect it. I think this is just better to use to show that you can refer to angels as God or Jehovah, or you could even translate that text in Zechariah, let me get back there, 12:18, like God, like a God, because they understood those gods, those angelic gods, to be essentially God or Jehovah, not some other God. That's why it's like Jehovah's angel before them. He's not sending some other God before them. It's some other angel or an angel, a spirit, who is that same God. And that's why things like this can be said. That's even why Jesus can say things like being the Alpha and the Omega in the book of Revelation. Because, especially at that time, he is fully authoritatively Jah. Either way, we'll get to that later. So back to this text. I don't think that's necessary, though, here, even in a Christian sense. But for a Jewish interpretation, Hebrew interpretation, apart from New Testament text that we'll get to in a moment, I just don't think this fits well with the rest of the text. That in terms of a variant reading, the one whom fits better with him here and him here than having me here. So you have manuscripts that also read him, that are consistent with him and him. So I think it's just internally, comparatively, structurally, it flows better with him in the Hebrew text than me. Now, when it comes to the Septuagint, I would argue that that's potentially some involvement with Trinitarian scholars or Trinitarian scholars, preservers of the text, people who believe Jesus was in fact the one pierced. But to show that, I think, is actually easier than just discussing the Hebrew of Zechariah 12:10 and showing the consistency with him versus me. Because in the New Testament, John, in John 19:37, quotes this text. And he uses the relative pronoun, who or him, the one. So why would John, writing in Greek, he may have written originally in Aramaic or Hebrew, but the text we have in Greek, whether he wrote it or it was copied in Greek to show what he was quoting, they were obviously using a text of Zechariah that had the relative pronoun, not me, not mu epsilon, but something like omicron nu, like what John quotes, the form of the relative pronoun. So that, to me, is the best way to show how you should interpret the text from a Christian standpoint. They will look to the one or him whom they pierced. John 19:37. How are you going to have an interpretation that's Christian, but that is not the same as John? So you're going to, as a Christian, I'm not talking to Jews now or Hebrew translators of Zechariah 12:10. As a Christian, you're going to translate Zechariah 12:10 knowing you have an option of him or me as me when John uses him. That seems like an attempt to force a view into the text, when you know very well that the text you accept in the New Testament tells you what the most likely reading was at that time. So, but that gives you at least an overview of some of the information that's available. Now, if you want, I've talked about Zechariah 12:10 as a translation issue and a textual issue in both my first edition, Jehovah's Witnesses Defended the First Edition. This is the table of contents from that right here, chapter 2, page 27. I'll get that in digital form for people who've been asking, probably by the end of this year, as well as 3 dissertations. I'm working on it, and a new version. But, and then in my second edition, I just snippeted out the contents right here near the right corner. Just look up Zechariah in the subject index. If you have the original one, you can look at the table of contents, the paper one. But if you have the digital version, just go to the back, the scripture index, look up Zechariah, and you'll see 12:10. And then you'll see the texts. There's several references that will give you information on the issues related to the text, in addition to what we've discussed. So, when we look at the information we have, I think we see a consistent pattern. We see a consistent pattern of credible pre-Christian texts that use the divine name, that prophesy about one who would come and stand in the name of Jehovah and shepherd people, and then give his life like a sheep, and be pierced, and then mourned over like an only son, like a firstborn. We believe that's Jesus. We believe if anyone who reads the New Testament texts that themselves are based on some of the best available evidence. You read those accounts involving Jesus, the things he did, and all the events leading up to the time when he was killed, how he was killed, by whom he was killed. And then you read these texts that were written in the case of the Nahal Hever, which doesn't have 12:10, but has the earlier part of Zechariah, about 30 years before, 30 to 60 years before he was born or taught. And then 3 other texts, at least that are dated to about 100 or more years before Jesus was born, that talk about the exact same things. And that we're carrying an oral tradition and written tradition about events that preceded the time of the flood and since the flood, and from places that were established by Noah and those with him, and then eventually down into Sumer, and then into Egypt, and then on with Moses and all those with him, who established a law that would allow the God Jah to fulfill his promise to Abraham, that he would make him into a nation that would produce a seed and that would inhabit a body that Jah himself would prepare so that he could survive and do the things that Jah told him to do. We believe all of these things came true in Jesus, and they were written about before he was born, and that these are part of a tradition that was preserved for us orally and in writing since the Garden of Eden, since the time of Adam and Eve and their expulsion, and their having children, and then they're passing on this information, and all the sons of God coming down to live on the earth, to build these monuments that are now underwater, or at mountaintop places, or buried under sand at places like Göbekli Tepe, not too far from Mount Ararat, and which looks like a holding center for all of those animals. If you haven't looked up Göbekli Tepe and compared those images on those gigantic stone pillars with what we read about in Genesis concerning the animals taken into that ark, I'm here to tell you it might shock your system. And I'm going to do a whole show on Göbekli Tepe and the account involving the animals that were preserved through the flood. And I believe you're going to be amazed like me when you see what they were doing based on the evidence that we have, not just the story. And when it comes to the story, look at the evidence we have. But we have more. We have actual places and locations being dug up right now. And in the case of Göbekli Tepe that have being uncovered since the 90s, and yet there's still so much more buried by sand. Sand. What could have moved that much sand? Well, I don't think it was people. And I'll tell you why when we talk more about Göbekli Tepe. So, remember John 19:37. That's your key to understanding the one who was pierced as Jesus. Not Jesus because he's Jehovah the Father, but Jesus because he is the Son of God. The Son, the firstborn over whom they wailed. The one who came down from heaven to earth to give his life as a man. Because our lives were forfeited by a man and a woman whom Jah made not to do the things they chose, although they were wrongly influenced in our view by another Son of God. So you have all these forces in our view and these things, the details about which you can read in these accounts, but that I mentioned for you, so to hopefully stimulate your interest. And you'll get a sense of all the amazing things that we have in these texts and that you can see as part of our history, not just some story. It's much more than that. And we have good evidence, what I consider the best, for believing that.